This is a little bit of an experiment for me. I'm going to try to project. I am, of course, wearing a mask, so you'll have to tell me if you can't hear me. Can folks out in the hallway, can you hear me? Am I projecting adequately? Wonderful. Okay. So hello and greetings to all of you. My name is Professor Gabriel Rosenberg. I'm a professor here in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. And I am unusually excited to be with you tonight. This is, if you'll indulge me for just one moment, my first in-person speaker event since January of 2020. And I suspect maybe as well yours. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's event, and of course our guest of honor, Jules Gill-Peterson. And I'm going to say more about Professor Gill-Peterson in just a moment, but I think it's first important to talk a little bit about the event itself and its namesake, to introduce the context for why we're here, which is, of course, the work of Eve Sedgwick. And so you're joining us for the annual Queer Theory Lecture in honor of Eve Sedgwick. That's Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies hosts this annual event to welcome, celebrate, and think alongside the most incisive and provocative scholars in the interdisciplinary field of queer theory in honor of one of its most incisive and provocative critics. Sedgwick spent most of her career here at Duke in the Department of English, where she authored field-defining works of queer literary criticism, Epistemology of the Closet in 1990, and Tendencies in 1993. And although she moved to the City University of New York in 1997, where she taught until her passing in 2009, she left an indelible mark on this community of scholars, which is to say here at Duke, and certainly, I think, the community of scholars in queer theory writ large. But in particular, Sedgwick's work helped to establish Duke as an intellectual leader in the critical study of sexuality. Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies hosts this event every year and has done so for now more than a decade as a tribute to Sedgwick and to help continue her legacy. So the Sedgwick Lecture then is the centerpiece of sexuality studies programming here at Duke. That programming covers lectures, workshops, film screenings, and other events, and also supports an undergraduate minor in sexuality studies here housed in GSF. And all of this activity is oriented towards charting the centrality of sex, sexual identity, and sex practices to the contemporary politics and culture in the United States and around the world. And I say this every time. If you're not already on our email list, you should get on it because our events are awesome. Yes, it's true. All of those things said, it is also without a doubt my personal favorite event that GSF hosts. Like, it's just straight up the thing I enjoy the most and I look forward to more than anything else. And so I can really think of no happier place to reunite with so many friends and to make new friends, to see so many intellectual comrades. And nor can I think of a better occasion to do all of those things than to get together and hear Professor Gill-Peterson speak. She's a research associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University, and with Grace Lavery, the current editor of Transgender Studies Quarterly. She is also the author of a groundbreaking monograph, Histories of the Transgender Child, published by the University of Minnesota in 2018. It's a book that received both a Lambda Literary Award and the Children's Literature Association Book Award. It is also, I think, a magnificent and rare book. I say this as a person with a PhD in history, that I therefore have to be very soberly dedicated to the notion of archival rigor. And indeed, it is an archival tour de force. That is absolutely how I would describe it. And one that is also, I would say, rich with theoretical creativity, conceptual innovation, and really just straightforwardly beautiful writing. It takes as its object the long-standing medical interest in the gender normativity and non-normativity of children. And it probes both the popular and continuing scholarly resistance to recognizing and reckoning with the very many transgender children that populate Gil Peterson's archives. In this sense, the book is also a remarkably timely intervention. And obviously the talk tonight, I don't think will be from the book, but I say this largely because I imagine and I suspect that the talk will also be an important and timely intervention. From debates about public accommodations to access to medical care, contemporary transphobic commenters are once again ominously fixated on transgender children as problems in need of solutions. And these commenters evince the same paradoxical anxiety that Gil Peterson notes was operative in previous historical moments, a simultaneous and certain avowal of gender's natural fixity at birth, and at once the fear that gender is so mutable that it can be conceived as a kind of social contagion when it is non-normative. These commenters also then tend to repurpose and ultimately weaponize narratives that seem superficially to steer clear of phobic panics, those heralding a so-called liberating newness and novelty to transgender recognition, the tipping point where transgender children are now in possession of vital instruments of self-knowledge that once they purportedly lacked. Oddly, identical temporal structures reinforce both celebratory narratives of trans tipping points and phobic narratives of, quote, rapid onset gender dysphoria. That is a temporal structure that not only erases transgender history, but seems to position it as a conceptual impossibility, with trans only ever an impending and frightening future, but never, in fact, an embodied and lived presence. And so against those tendencies, Gil Peterson works to trouble the tidy linearity of that history, as well as to refuse the political uses to which that erasure might be put. I think in this way, and particularly in a place like North Carolina, this is work that is timely, powerful, and essential. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Jules Gil Peterson.
Wow. This too for me is the first in-person thing, and the only in-person thing on my schedule other than teaching. So yeah, thanks for coming out. I just feel like, more alive than normal. So I'm going to try and channel that, including into my voice, but how am I sounding okay. But, feel free to put your hand up if I'm starting to dwindle. That doesn't sound like me, but, stranger things have happened. Gosh, wow, to say that I'm honored to be here and delivering this lecture would be about the biggest understatement that I could make. So by way of thanks, but also briefly situating myself, I wanted to say that I've been incomparably lucky to have a pretty rich and collegial relationship with many people here at Duke, especially in gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, which has invited me several times to share work from really the earliest possible stage of my career, offering not just critical shaping for my thinking, but lending a sense of competence that I've since come to prize as essential to being myself in the academy, and a competence I shall aim to put to bold use this evening. Many of you have been really generous with your time, and your own scholarship has informed mine in ways that bibliographic citations will only ever hint at. So my deepest thanks are due to Gabe Rosenberg for inviting me, and to Julie Winmore for all of the work in making this visit possible, especially during the pandemic. To be invited to deliver the annual Queer Theory lecture at this stage in my career, which at least to me still feels early or young, is truly very special. But what also feels special is being asked to give a queer theory lecture, one founded no less in the memory of Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick. Generationally, I might think of myself as touching on several characteristics of the cohorts of scholars who inherit that field today. I was too young to have ever crossed paths with Eve, though part of that is also geographical because I simply didn't move to the United States until I started graduate school. Still, as a young wayward child who wanted to earn a PhD in queer studies, I've counted myself lucky to have been mentored by and made deep attachments to many people who were, in fact, Eve's students, particularly towards the end of her career. Through their stories about her teaching, mentoring, and through electric readings of her work, I have felt a live wire of vicarious connection that I actually longed for from a younger age. If you can imagine, I was an even greener 19-year-old, I think, in the HQ stacks of the library at the glorious University of Ottawa in Canada, plucking epistemology of the closet between men and tendencies off the shelves for the first time, during a semester in which I was also reading Judith Butler, but in French. So for me, it will always be trouble dans le genre. And this was in a class taught by a butch philosopher who commuted actually in from Montreal every morning and also looked suspiciously like Butler. I remember distinctly the idea reaching me for the first time that semester that thinking could be tethered to and energized by the sexual. That thinking was something like sex, or reading was, to borrow my mentor Catherine von Stockton's words, having sex with ideas, was a notion so life-giving to a prematurely exhausted young Jules that I became eager at that age to persevere on this earth, if only long enough to claim an inheritance as a scholar of this exquisite queer theory. What actual vertigo, then, to be here today, having found in taking myself seriously enough to transition and escape philosophy from that old fatalism, by the very same token through which I am not so much a queer theorist as an emblem of trans studies, the sometimes would-be critic of the very earth-quaking queer theories that turned me on to academia in the first place. I find these contrapuntal forces evidence of the kind of sticky situation that feels possibly worthy of the feeling I first encountered all those years ago in the library reading my first Sedgwick. And so it is in that spirit of writing into, or reading into, in this case, viscosity, a texture that forms of my flesh and soul as much as any text I have to offer you tonight, rather than clarifying their constituents, that I offer this lecture. So it will move in 4 short parts, each of which, I should say, glimpses aspects of a book project that's in quite early stages, one that I'm provisionally titling A Brief History of Trans Femininity. So thank you for sharing your time with me this evening in person and for those who are watching, and I'm really looking forward to talking with all of you. Part 1, Family Matters. For nearly 3 decades, queer theory and trans studies have been telling stories about their strained relationship. Like any good family romance, the story of the relationship frequently stands in for the relationship form itself, sometimes occluding in conflict what might really be a stubborn foreclosure, or anxiously and even jealously defending a claim to one's territory, hungrily fighting for recognition from would-be parents or siblings, or just like the neighbors, in an era where both these stepchildren of the academy must recognize that their moments in the sun fall during resolutely hard times in the family home. The conflict is the origin story, I mean. If academic trans studies retrospectively calls itself into being through a rather narrow American English-speaking and late 1980s moment of humanistic or cultural knowledge production, it thereby installs a relationship to queer theory as the very grounds of its emergence and viability. No wonder it feels insecure next to its siblings. In a 2000 revision to her foundational essay, The Empire Strikes Back, a post-transsexual manifesto, Sandy Stone offers a curiously diplomatic line in her new afterword, writing, quote, "Transgender theory would appear to be successfully engaging the nascent discourses of queer theory, in a number of graceful and mutually productive respects, and this is reason for guarded celebration. That optimism reads, at least to me today, as somewhat forced. Only 2 years earlier, J. Prosser's landmark monograph, Second Skins, grounded its transsexual theory of the embodied subject in transition through a pretty long and sustained critique of queer theory for its instrumentalization of the transgender subject, quote, to enable affiliation and identification between gay men and lesbians, end quote, discharging the question of trans people's material lives for the conceptual play of tropology. In the same year as Stone's afterward, 2000, Vivian Namaste indicted this queer theoretical maneuver on much wider grounds, arguing that the, quote, invocation of transgendered figures in mass culture, including academic theory, quote, reduces transsexuality to the figural dimensions of discourse, and within such constraints, transsexuality is inscribed as literally impossible. By 2004, the familial metaphor was secured by Susan Stryker's enduring proposal that transgender studies was something like the evil twin of queer theory. Stryker's now canonized essay, My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix, published in the inaugural volume of GLQ, had worked on the assumption that queer and trans went together very well indeed, though that was something that for Stryker was primarily informed by a social and activist world in the San Francisco Bay Area, not disciplinary convention. Yet that 1990s utopian flash had seemingly been snuffed out by 2004 when she wrote that, quote, all too often, transgender phenomena are misapprehended through a lens that privileges sexual orientation and sexual identity as the primary means of differentiating from heteronormativity. More disturbingly, transgender increasingly functions as the site in which to contain all gender trouble, thereby helping secure both homosexuality and heterosexuality as stable and normative categories of personhood. This was Stryker's definition of the word homonormativity, one that is not as often cited or remembered as Lisa Dugan's or Michael Warner's. And apparently things have just never really recovered. Stryker's essay has seeded a veritable industry of missives and evaluatives, mining the queer versus trans issue. In trans studies alone, the major essays on the subject now include entries by Kyle Keegan, Cameron Awkward-Rich, Talia Betcher, Emma Heaney, Amy Marvin, Cassius Adair, Ava Hayward, Che Gossett, Grace Lavery, and yours truly. In fact, the most read article in TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly, in 2019 was After Trans Studies, a polemic and playful dialogue staged between graduate students Andrea Long Chu and Emmett Harson-Draeger that, among other things, diagnosed trans studies with failing to differentiate itself from queer theory. And last year, TSQ devoted an entire section of a special issue on the state of the field to responses to Chu and Harson-Draeger, most of which expounded upon the field's relationship to queer theory. Okay, the point is, the queer and trans siblings, or twins, or rivals, estranged antagonists, or really whatever you want to call them, pick your own figuration here, seem to have unfinished business. Or, so the story goes. After all, siblings like to exaggerate, don't they? I think a few contextual caveats might serve to thicken the plot with relatively minimal effort. Transgender functioned much more akin to a verb or adjective in the 1990s when a lot of these fights came about, and today it's more likely taken to be a noun. When I teach trans studies, I find myself contextualizing this Stone to Prosser to Namaste to Stryker arc of the 1990s in that way. The term transgender has a genealogy fully outside of the academy and literary theory, but the way it was specifically adopted by scholars reflected its non-identitarian meaning of loosely to transgender, with spaces in between those three words. That is, to cross gender, usually by way of an identification, though sometimes by way of representation or a deconstruction of something. Transgender as an adjective or in a verb form shares a lot more affinity, not to mention connotation, with queer compared to transgender as identity, noun, or transgender as a population descriptor. So much of the early trans critiques of queer, I think, could be read simply as a conceptual struggle to discharge transgender of its adjectival form. Secondly, some of these scholars have since revised or even recanted their positions. Perhaps most famously, J. Prosser largely overturned the central thesis of his own book in a moving 1999 article that takes the form of a palinode, which I had to look up, which is a poem in which the writer retracts a previous work by inviting consideration of what had been that text's unconscious or outside. Really beautiful essay. But more broadly, scholars, say like Stryker, have consistently revised, rethought, and continued writing, as we hopefully do, transforming the terms of their engagement with these fields as those fields themselves have profoundly changed over time. Which brings me to my third possible thickener. The textual genealogies of queer and trans studies are very easily thought otherwise. I don't really think I have to convince anyone of that, but queer studies is a richly sprawling field that can hardly claim a clear center or fiefdom of proper objects. And then trans studies, too, is facing very productive internal critique over its citational parameters. I'll just name one especially promising iteration. Cameron Awkward-Rich recently asked in a 2020 keynote address to the Thinking Trans Thinking Conference what trans studies would look like if its emergence were narrated not so much through the white transsexual subject's autobiographical predicate and its post-structuralist deconstruction, think Sandy Stone and Susan Stryker, but through someone like Polly Murray, whose wide-ranging intellectual and political project is only belatedly and lately getting its due as a Black trans one. The queer versus trans debate would become largely, I think, irrelevant if Polly Murray's trans studies were the dominant one. In sum, I have my doubts about the sibling rivalry, but that isn't even the point that I want to make this evening. Having taken such pains to cast doubt on the convenience of queer and trans studies as antagonists, I propose something a little, I think, counterintuitive. I want to mine the disagreement more closely, just without endorsing it. That is, I think there is a value in returning to the alleged scene of the crime or the familial trespass, but not to iron out the dispute. No, much more like a tired and ticked-off matriarch at the end of a long day, I mean to identify a shared foreclosure to read for what both fields have avoided thinking, and to me, that is the impossibility of the trans woman, particularly the trans woman of color, as a subject, as an author of knowledge. And I shall claim zero objectivity in the pursuit, for you see, it's rather personal being myself that very subject. And so we shall start somewhere risky and painful with a death. Part 2, her name was Venus. When Prosser and Namaste claimed at the end of the 1990s that queer theory was conceptually profiteering off transgender as an adjective and selling out transgender people in the process, they both meant Judith Butler. The full critique of the theoretical maneuvers of queer around transgender crossings includes Gender Trouble, actually also includes Sedgwick's work in Epistemology of the Closet, to which I'll return. But a wound was opened and perhaps a scar or callus formed around a chapter of Butler's 1996 monograph, Bodies That Matter. I'm referring to the chapter Gender is Burning, in which Butler undertakes a reading of Jenny Livingston's 1990 documentary, Paris is Burning. For Butler's part, the chapter replied to a rash of rather shallow readings of the function of drag in Gender Trouble. Butler turned to Paris is Burning to inquire into the limits of subversion, or the parody or citation of norms, the places where their citation does not function to magnify the stress points in a matrix of sex and gender, but rather rigidifies them. For the role of the subject who does not denaturalize so much as re-idealize the norm, Butler cast Venus Extravaganza, one of the subjects of Livingston's documentary, a brown trans woman and sex worker who was killed before the film's release, something incorporated into the film in a way that magnified the broader questions about authorship, exploitation, ethnographic gazes, and compensation that came to mark Paris's burning. Butler turns to Extravaganza's death as the evidence for the argument of the chapter, namely that, quote, sometimes a fatally unsubversive appropriation takes place. Presumably, we are led to think instead of a queerly subversive one. Now, I generally agree with the critics of this chapter, so I don't have an original commentary to offer you, but here is one of its signal passages. In the pursuit of realness, this subject is produced, a phantasmatic pursuit that mobilizes identifications, underscoring the phantasmatic promise that constitutes an identificatory move. A promise which, taken too seriously, can culminate only in disappointment and disidentification. A fantasy that for Venus, because she dies, killed apparently by one of her clients, perhaps after the discovery of those remaining organs, cannot be translated into the symbolic. This is a killing that is performed by a symbolic that would eradicate those phenomena that require an opening up of the possibilities for the resignification of sex. If Venus wants to become a woman and cannot overcome being a Latina, then Venus is treated by the symbolic precisely the ways in which women of color are treated. Her death thus testifies to a tragic misreading of the social map of power. In so many words, I think it is fair to say that the undertone of this reading blames Extravaganza for her own death. In her tragic miscalculation of wanting to be a real woman, to be with a man, to have wealth and security, the symbolic ordains that she must die, for she is a Latina with a penis, and that makes her desires phantasmatic, to a degree inadmissible by the racialized and sex powers that be. Now, Prosser and Namaste do this work line by line. If you really want a full-throated critique, writes Prosser, quote, "It is not for being a woman of color, but for failing to be one that Venus is murdered. It is the crossing, the trans movement that provokes her erasure," end quote. Adds Namaste, quote, "Butler elides both Extravaganza's transsexual status and her work as a prostitute. Here is the point. Venus was killed because she was a transsexual prostitute. Since Butler has reduced Extravaganza's transsexuality to an allegory, she cannot conceptualize the specificity of violence with which transsexuals, especially transsexual prostitutes, are faced," end quote. Okay, I think they're both right. But what interests me is not the intellectual content at hand. I would find it fairly misplaced today to relitigate something published 27 years ago, when Butler's career and work has transformed and is rather staunchly trans-feminist lately. Talking to you, The Guardian. All right, newspaper. To foreshadow where I'm going, I also don't subscribe to the family drama by which the role of trans studies is to act out a sibling rivalry that, for me, much to my chagrin, would also be Oedipal, since I was trained by queer theorists. I rather see this chapter as symptomatic of a broader logic by which the trans woman of color's value is restricted to and policed as an object of inquiry, never a subject. My mourning for Extravaganza is not just for her death, a kind of death that is honestly no less pervasive amongst my friends, lovers, and family today than in 1990, but also for the way that her death is doubled by a suppression in writing of her desire and claim to realness in order to make of her an object lesson. Now Venus Extravaganza, she seeks a certain transubstantiation of gender in order to find an imaginary man who will designate a class and race privilege that promises a permanent shelter from racism, homophobia, and poverty, writes Butler in a curious moment. Why the emphatic familiarity? Why the repetition of her given name, Venus? And Butler is hardly alone in the stylistic move. In Bell Hooks's Is Paris Burning?, the central text that Butler critiques in this chapter, Hooks does the same thing, addressing the director of the film throughout as Livingston, but Extravaganza only as Venus. Perhaps there is no coincidence at hand, merely a repetition compulsion of a very old epistemic violence, one gathered around and attached to the figure made unnameable through her constant naming, Venus, the Venus that Saidiya Hartman finds at the root of a certain style of thought in the wake of slavery. Extravaganza is not that Venus in important ways. She lives in the late 20th century and she is not Black, but Hartman's call is not for taxonomy so much as a reckoning with the limits of what can be known about a person made unperson in an archive. One cannot ask who is Venus, writes Hartman, because it would be impossible to answer such a question. There are hundreds of thousands of other girls who share her circumstances, and these circumstances have generated few stories. And the stories that exist are not about them, but rather about the violence, excess, mendacity, and reason that seized hold of their lives, transformed them into commodities and corpses, and identified them with names tossed off as insults and crass jokes, end quote. Once again, this cannot literally describe extravaganza being meant for a different archive, and yet. Let us begin again, then, slightly differently, and see if we can probe the conditions of why it is always the trans woman of color whose desires, experience, and presence must be minimized, must be cut down, must be abstracted, and must be converted into a tale of what was done to her, so that we can never know her precisely to the perverse extent that she occupies the very center of our thinking. Part 3, against queer versus trans. Admittedly, today, we are far less likely to encounter the deaths of trans women of color in such theoretical terms. The pendulum has swung hard in the other direction. And I am alarmed at the dominant narratological poverty that circulates around the figure of the trans woman of color. I am extremely critical of that figuration of the trans woman of color as a political signifier that floats not just left trans politics, but also much of queer and trans studies, particularly in their shared historical imaginaries. The trans woman of color appears generically as a kind of rhetoric or as a symbol, invoked as the figure in whose name activism or intersectional scholarship is conducted, but the trans woman of color becomes just that, a figure. Centering her has not actually resulted in much curiosity or sustained engagement with her everyday life expertise and activism. Had left trans political movements, or in this case, queer and trans studies, done so, the primary issues of concern for them would be prison abolition, police violence, and sex work. Not a queer, and I should say anti-transsexual, sometimes non-binary politics of overcoming the gender binary, whatever that really means, or at its narrowest, the highly conservative claim that trans women of color deserve to be rescued from violence or death. As C. Riley Snorton and Jin Harita-Warren have compellingly argued, the necropolitical logic governing the circulation of the figures of the Black trans woman and the trans woman of color are vitalized by the very material violence they invoke and record. Trans activism and queer and trans studies frequently rely on the circulation of Black trans and trans of color suffering and death to produce their highly valued racialized knowledge of gender. And in this economy, the trans woman of color is really often the preface to knowledge production, but never really its author. And so for one example of this process, I'll risk submitting a very foundational text of queer color critique. I'm referring to Rod Ferguson's Aberrations in Black, which opens by invoking the figure of the Black trans femme, or more precisely, what Ferguson calls a Black drag queen prostitute a passing figure in a scene from Marlon Riggs's 1989 film, Tongues Untied. If we linger on this figure's appearance, I think a question immediately arises. Why, in a film that is a deeply important statement about Black gay men, does Ferguson instead turn to the one brief appearance of a trans femme? This woman appears midway through Tongues Untied, with very little context and without a speaking role. As she wanders a public space and smokes a cigarette, an Essex Hemphill poem is read as the voiceover, and a Nina Simone song plays softly in the background. We don't really learn anything about who she is or what her relationship to the rest of the men in the film is meant to signify. Ferguson, for his part, minds her appearance for what it figures, asking of queer color critique, quote, what mode of analysis would be appropriate for interpreting the drag queen prostitute as an image that allegorizes and symbolizes that social heterogeneity, end quote, of Black life. Those two words, allegorize and symbolize, are what hold my attention. Aberration in Black's queer of color critique is not so much about what this Black trans femme knows or does with the situation of her life, but rather employs her as the precondition for a critique of racial capital and the positive establishment of an intersectional analytic for queer studies. Indeed, this black drag queen prostitute disappears after the first few pages of the introduction in a way that often I have noticed when I teach this book leads students or readers to confuse her with the femme on the cover of the book. I absolutely don't mean to pick on Ferguson, whose work I admire and am deeply indebted to. Rather, one of the larger historical questions I'm interested in is the degree to which trans femininity's archive is indissociably that of the gay male imaginary. There is a way to read the 20th century figure of the trans femme street queen as central to the gay male imaginary of abjection and the stigma of effeminacy, something like the intensification of gay men's haunting by the sexological concept of inversion, where their homosexuality always contains the possibility of going, so to speak, all the way. There is also an important question as to whether African American cultures of nightlife, gender, and sexuality, right, we could think for only one obvious example of the Harlem Renaissance's rich ball culture, whether or not that doesn't offer a less sexological genealogy on the ground in reply to this question. In any case, I want to make it clear that it's really unsurprising that queer theories that elevate gay men's culture and social worlds would also fixate, as those men themselves did, on their uneasy proximity to the trans femme. So part of what I'm actually interested in here is not so much the fact of that, but rather the stasis of this allegorical symptomatic reading, which I think Ferguson's scholarly arc from aberrations to the present happens to illustrate well, but many other texts could easily illustrate this. In his Kessler lecture at the CUNY Graduate Center last year, Ferguson began with and invoked the Trans Women of Color of Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR, as the proper intersectional ground for resisting fascism in the 21st century. In his words, a kind of lumpen proletariat that would guide us alongside the white male thinkers of the Frankfurt School. I definitely don't have time to give a full reading of this lecture, but I find the scalability of the reading practice at hand very interesting. So at one moment, Ferguson put up this image, this still, taken from Silvia Rivera's infamous 1973 speech at New York Pride. Ferguson suggested that, quote, Rivera's outcry at the Christopher Street Liberation Day implores us to consider how fascism recruits us into its regimes of acceptance, end quote. The visual still of Rivera's speech, I think, fills in a rather large set of historical gaps, from the specific concern of the speech in 1973, which was the police, jail, and intramural violence from an ascendantly trans-exclusionary gay liberation movement, to make it signify the vanguard of an intersectional anti-fascist political program for everyone in the working classes across time. That is to say, I have my doubts about how this archival moment can ever certify the interpretation given except through extreme idealization. And yet, Rivera's 1973 speech is hardly what I would characterize as material for idealization. As an angry indictment she had to physically fight her way on stage to deliver, I would read it more as an emblem of trans negativity or rage. I don't think the text of Rivera's speech nor the context of its delivery authorizes this extrapolation. Ferguson concludes his lecture by saying, quote, "In their full appreciation, these histories encourage us to meet each other's needs and demand social change. There, in the lumpen household, filled with queens who floated from room to room, and with puppies that played and snuggled, we might find our model and inspiration," end quote. Model and inspiration, and also puppies. But nothing more than a few interview scraps and a picture of the Star House from a census tract in New York City is cited as archival evidence that we find in our imagined intimate lives of these idealized trans women of color floating from room to room dreamily, as if this were not a dirt-poor tenement, as if this is a kind of ready-made intersectional program for proper anti-fascist justice in the 21st century. As an historian, and it's easy for me to say this, I can only wonder how the archive is able to signify so much that is not there, except through the idealizing desire and correspondingly speculative reading practice of a politics derived from 2020, not 1973. There is perhaps more broadly a fetish of the visible in play here, despite the definitive critiques of the trap of visibility made by a range of critical voices, including Tourmaline, Johanna Burton, and Eric Stanley in Trapdoor, and of course it was Tourmaline who we have to thank for having access to a lot of these archival materials in the first place. But that is to say, there is a presumption that indexing the mere presence of a Black trans woman or a trans woman of color leaps into meaning or politics. The trans woman of color is so often, like the Black femme from Tongues Untied, a pretty performative subject whose presence is mostly aesthetic or evocative, rather than also being a person or even a fully fledged historical actor beyond a symbolic register. This is the dilemma that concerns me. The instrumentalization of the trans woman of color as figure, as predicate, as object lesson, but never as person, subject, or author, beyond an idealized set of political desires projected onto her, in her name. This suppression and resignification of the trans woman of color may have been there in Butler's reading of Extravaganza, but it is there in Ferguson's reading of Rivera too. It is present in queer studies, but frankly, it is just as present, if not more ubiquitous in trans studies. And I will give no citations for that. And so here I want to suggest that we have really good grounds to give up the supposed fight between queer and trans studies. Both are founded on the consumption of the trans women of color for their political imaginaries. This takes me to part 4, the last part, the trans woman's dilemma. I subtitled this lecture, "What's Trans About Queer Studies Now?" Both in a cheeky nod to What's Queer About Queer Studies Now, a landmark issue of GLQ from 2005, but also as a citation of a phrase that has already appeared in print in trans studies. It's an eponymous essay written by Kyle Keegan. But ultimately for me, it's expression of frustration with a certain strain of very contemporary trans critique of queer studies that I find misplaced, as in it conveniently avoids the diagnosis I've made, largely to my mind, by avoiding the constitutive forces of history and race. I think of this something like the trans woman's dilemma today, since it comes into sharp focus in a rich essay by my colleague and co-editor at TSQ, Grace Lavery. In Egg Theory's early style, which appeared in that TSQ State of the Field issue last year that I earlier mentioned, Lavery treats the egg. Okay, that's the vernacular term in trans communities for someone who has recently accepted that they are trans, but hasn't figured out what is to be done about it. Egg discourse is the form through which trans people reason that they specifically cannot transition, even though they are trans, or that transition as such is impossible. But usually, before they finally do actually transition. For many trans people, egg is thus a retrospective designation when you give yourself after you've started transition, although increasingly, it has generated interesting social media communities of self-identified eggs on platforms like Reddit, and they make good memes, so. As Lavery puts it, quote, egg theory is not generally ethical, but technical, end quote. Transition cannot be accomplished, or sex cannot actually be changed, and therefore it simply won't be, no matter how much one might wish otherwise. There is a severe fatalism to its literalism. And as a matter of individual suffering, I think the egg is particularly given to depression. However, Lavery identifies what she calls the second step of egg theory as, quote, its abstraction, via a curious and ambivalent universalism into a set of general observations about a system, end quote. Rather than the individual, the egg would now say, if transition cannot be accomplished for me, it shall not be allowed for anyone. And as one example of that leap, Lavery offers queer theory. More precisely, she writes that, quote, queer theory is, in certain of its guises, indistinguishable from egg theory. Not because the two habits of thought are the same, but because egg theory is drawn to queer theory's engagement with a sexuality athwart identity, an account of sexuality that derives from something more, less, or other than identity, end quote. And Lavery's exemplary queer theorist is Eve Sedgwick. She first reads Sedgwick's infamous confession in the essay White Glasses of her, quote, identification or even identity as a gay man, end quote. For Lavery, the gallows humor of the Cancer memoir softens the implications of the impossibility of Sedgwick's identification with gay men. And the second piece of textual evidence she submits is Sedgwick's famous essay, How to Bring Your Kids Up Gay, where Sedgwick indicts the homophobic pursuit of preventing the existence of gay adults by clinically pathologizing gender nonconformity in young children through the new 1980 DSM diagnosis, gender identity disorder of childhood. And this was largely accomplished by clinicians working out at the University of California, Los Angeles. Sedgwick mounts a spirited defense of the gay child, but makes no mention of any trans children or trans diagnoses under the rubric of gender identity disorder, when in fact there were many. Lavery thus interprets an operative paranoia in Sedgwick's essay and its effort to defend gay children, quote, an apparent conflict of interests between gay and trans people, end quote. Here enters my dilemma, because I find these readings of Sedgwick, well, wrong. And I say that with deep love for Grace, who is a friend and a dear fellow trans woman in the academy. I hope that it's clear by now that I have no personal or actual dislike for any of the people that I'm critiquing tonight. On the contrary. Yet I detect precisely no such paranoia in How to Bring Your Kids Up Gay. I think the paranoia may be that which belongs to the former egg. As I try to articulate in the 5th chapter and in the conclusion to my book, Histories of the Transgender Child, gender nonconformity in children has long been instrumentalized in the service of child-killing ends by the helping professions and concerned adults alike. I really doubt I have to convince anyone of that in 2021, as we are sadly living out most of the logics I anxiously dissected in my book. But more specifically, if Sedgwick missed that the clinical scene she was indicting in her essay was one in which gay and trans children were both abused and subject to attempts at conversion therapy, I can't arrive at Lavery's conclusion that this has to do with a rearguard attempt by a queer theorist to save the gay child by ruling in his favor over the invisible trans child. On the contrary, having only found evidence of that trans child through archival research, through which I had access to medical records and clinical notes, my conclusion remains as it did in my book, that Sedgwick does nothing so much as miss details that are eminently missable in the published clinical literature upon which she quite understandably relies, writing in the 1990s, as opposed to me researching as an historian in the 2010s. The separation of gender identity from sexuality is a massive historical process in which queer theory is implicated, but for which it is hardly the principal or even really a very important actor. Apologies to queer theory. My point ultimately in the book was to trouble the notion that the trans child could ever be the successor to the gay child, a periodization that has caused disaster this year in its enabling of all sorts of anti-trans politics and moral panics around children with openly genocidal aspirations. Here in North Carolina, the state legislature considered a bill that would have mandated that teachers report and out any child displaying gender nonconforming behavior to their parents or guardians. It was an explicitly anti-trans bill, part of over 100 entertained in over half the states and 13 passed this year. Yet even that bill obviously creates an impossible situation in which gay and trans children would be legally harassed, despite wishing to target trans kids specifically because the locus is gender nonconformity, which can be a code for homosexuality. So, at the risk of quoting myself, here's what I wrote in my book. And it's kind of a long quote, but I have a point. And this is me talking about Sedgwick's essay. There is a way one could read the introduction of gender identity disorder into the DSM in 1980 as a proxy for pathologizing homosexuality in proto-gay boys, while also excluding the many trans children who are also interpolated into that new classification. That is clearly not Sedgwick's intention. But in the wake of How to Bring Your Kids Up Gay, the trans child, unlike the effeminate boy, has received no attention in queer theory. This reading of the DSM lends credence to the idea that there were somehow no trans children at that moment. Only when the psychiatric treatment of proto-gay boys for effeminacy becomes politically intolerable in the 2000s would the label gender identity disorder be applied to transgender children instead. As gay children were folded into the state as protectable under certain highly racialized circumstances, transgender children became the new focus of pathologizing discourse, or so the story might go. That seems to be a phrase that I like. I end this quote by saying, to be clear, this extrapolation does not exist per se in queer theory, end quote. Okay, so that's How to Bring Your Kids Up Gay. What of white glasses? Lavery makes a moving claim to the impact of queer theory's egg style on her own biography as a scholar. This is the last block quote of the night. I will say, for my part, that an identification that remains psychic or notional, as Sedgwick's does with gay men, is not merely the theory of an egg voice that prevented me from seeking transsexual healthcare for a couple of decades and still admonishes me for having done so. It is also, and more consequentially, the voice that harasses trans people for the force of our identifications in the name and voice of queer theory, end quote. Here Lavery is referring to real-world harassment from queer theorists, namely two at the Penn State University who attempted in 2018 to denounce her for a piece that she had published in the Los Angeles Review of Books, which was actually critiquing an anti-trans manifesto of the free speech variety that one of them had posted on a departmental website. Indeed, they did denounce Lavery and trans women in general through recourse to their fantasy of a proper and rigorous queer theory. Basically it was like, queer theory teaches us to be playful and identificatory. Trans studies is just people who take things too literally, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and here, of course, I agree with Lavery. The outrageously anti-intellectual, mean-spirited, and frankly, bad faith trans misogyny directed at trans women in the academy is something like the worst nightmare concretization of an earlier moment of queer theory's conceptual harassment of transsexual women. And on the whole, I'd agree with her that the real-world harassment of actual trans women in the academy is concretely worse than any conceptual or epistemic equivalent. But I think it's fair to say that it was relatively easy to outsource that structuring vitriol onto the transsexual woman when she wasn't in the academy, when she was spectacularized in the racialized bodies of sex workers in documentaries or short films. Now that a small handful of us are here, witness the moral panics and hysterical claims from highly protected, institutionally entrenched, and rewarded scholars that the proverbial sky is falling, and they are victims of the very illiberal tactics they regularly employ without a hint of irony to try and chase us out. But Eve Sedgwick? Even textually? No, I don't buy it. I agree that there are entire styles of systemic thinking, including inherited dimensions of queer theory, that have claimed it is impossible to be what trans women are in a very provocative way, real. And actually, Butler's Gender is Burning chapter, I think, qualifies under that heading in a way that Sedgwick's work in the 1990s just patently does not. But again, I also see this logic at play in most of trans studies. Frankly, I see it at play in all logics governing sex, gender, and sexuality. It is ubiquitous. To frame the parameters as a contest between queer versus trans, which is really usually shadowboxing for sexuality versus gender, to me misses the point. If anything, I think what egg theory falls for, perhaps by design, because its temporal form is one that relies upon succession from ontological or technical impossibility to the reparative compensation of transition, is the temptation to reify a passage from queer to trans that I so strongly caution against in Histories of the Transgender Child, and I will reaffirm my caution against right now for the nth time. Of course, that passage, in this case, is undertaken with the strongest trans affirmative motives, and it does take place in a profoundly transphobic context. But it runs aground of what I saw in the archive of the clinic at UCLA, and like that history, it makes things rather too neat. And so I arrive at the end to what I normally do, which is history. As a historian, my sense of the reason that queer and trans seem predisposed to conflict in general is that homosexuality and transness, particularly trans femininity, are uncomfortably interimplicated through a shared sexological genealogy in the West, an inheritance that is not easily disavowed. Personally, I see no reason to disavow it. It remains unclear, despite over a century of intense cultural effort to do so, how one could ever finally cleave homosexuality from gender variance, and in turn, transness from certain histories of homosexuality. And here I find the Sedgwick of epistemology of the closet with her emphasis on the incommensurability of, but also mutual production of the gender transitive and gender separatist models of homosexuality, a really useful reference point. More useful, maybe, than the psychoanalytically inflected investment in egoic identification and its indeterminacies that are more prevalent, say, in Butler's work from the same period. In any case, as you can gather, I'm interested in the history of racialized trans femininity as a way of thinking simply productively rather than antagonistically about this century-long frisson and entanglement. This lecture, largely drawn from the introduction to that project, will then move on to treat trans femininity as an irreducible historical form, not a subdivision of a generic trans nor a conceptual predicate to a politically virtuous queer, with a history that frankly concerns categories of criminalization and labor, such as sex work, that freely mix gay and trans in surprising ways, rather than worrying over their proper boundaries. And so, to return to the title of this talk, what's trans about queer studies now? And what's trans about trans studies now, for that matter? Honestly, that's not a question I could answer tonight, other than to say, until women like Venus Extravaganza, Black and brown trans women, are just as much the ambivalent, complex, and split subjects and objects of knowledge production as anyone else in the academy, I don't much care what the answer is. Thank you.